presentation. And so with this, I'm going to pass the floor off to Nate, and he's going to introduce the Zuma Scientist series.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this Zuma Scientist session. Welcome to the Zuma Scientist series. So this series is sponsored by Lake Champlain Sea Grant, UVM Extension, and SUNY Plattsburgh's education program known as Watershed Alliance. Lake Champlain Sea Grant develops and shares science-based knowledge to benefit the environment and economies of the Lake Champlain Basin. Watershed Alliance aims to reach K-12 students and their teachers throughout the Lake Champlain Basin. Our goal is to increase awareness and knowledge of watershed issues in youth throughout Vermont and New York. The Zuma Scientist series was created in response to the current need for more virtual programs. Every Tuesday and Friday from now until the end of June, we will be hosting a guest scientist to tell us more about their research or work in the basin. Just as a heads up, this webinar is currently being live streamed to our YouTube channel, and this, as well as all of our other sessions, are archived there for future use by teachers or community members or whoever wants to access this information. So let me introduce today's presenters. So join me in welcoming Justin and Sarah. So Justin Geibel is a project manager with the Vermont Youth Conservation Corp, focusing on water quality. He holds a master's in plant and soil science from the University of Vermont, has worked as an environmental research technician, outdoor educator, and park ranger, and is a 2020 Water Quality and Conservation Careers Fellow with Lake Champlain Sea Grant. Sarah Hoffmeier holds a master's degree in landscape design, is a Vermont certified horticulturalist and owner of Ecolibrium Design LLC, an ecologically focused landscape design and build company. She and her husband, Alex, started the business soon after moving to Vermont over a decade ago, and they continue to work towards creating strong partnerships, healthy designs, and landscapes that can encourage people to learn and interact with nature. Sarah is a landscape designer and plant nerd and thinks it's rad how plants can heal not only people, but unhealthy environments as well. That's something we have in common. Today, they'll be delivering a talk titled Green Stormwater Infrastructure, Incorporating Natural Systems into the Developed Landscape. Infrastructure is the basic equipment and structures that are essential for functional, healthy, and vibrant communities. The natural infrastructure we rely on to mitigate the impacts of human development are often overwhelmed, and this is the case in managing stormwater and water pollution. Green stormwater infrastructure allows us to incorporate analogs of natural systems into our developed landscape to help mitigate the impacts of our development. Let's explore the concepts of green stormwater infrastructure technology and take a look at real-life installation that is a small piece of a larger effort to support healthy communities and a healthy Lake Champlain. So with that, welcome Justin and Sarah, and I will turn it over to you all.
Great, thank you so much for having me and Sarah, and let me share my screen here. How does that, can we see that on your end?
Yep, you're looking good.
Okay, great. Let me just find my, all right, thank you again. Sorry for the delay there. Again, my name is Justin Geibel. I'm a water quality project manager with the VYCC. And as much as I wanted to make this just about talking about VYCC, I figured we would dive into a topic that's a growing piece of what the VYCC Water Quality Initiative's work incorporates, and a really neat opportunity to talk about stormwater and some concepts around it. And we also have Sarah here with us to really dive into technical details of an installation that we worked on together down in Montpelier. So bear with me while I kind of dive into some of the more conceptual side of things. And then Sarah, we can talk about some of the design concepts and what went into that installation specifically. So to start, the goals for today, one is to briefly give you a quick introduction of VYCC and what we do, who we are, and the water quality program specifically. I want to introduce GSI, or Green Stormwater Infrastructure, kind of from a conceptual point of view, and think about how development affects our water quality and the principles of GSI and how they are meant to manage water quality. So, and then finally, jumping into a case study of this particular installation that was constructed back last summer in Montpelier at the VSECU property in Montpelier. So hope to understand a little bit of the design process and learn a little bit about that particular installation that we're both quite proud of. So to introduce VYCC, I was hoping that in the chat box, if anyone tuning in here has participated in VYCC or familiar with us in a particular way, feel free to share in that chat, and I can follow up with those later. But we were founded in 1985. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our model is based on small, diverse groups of young people working on significant and important projects. And we do that through quite a few different sort of sectors of our work, through conservation, agriculture, water quality, and forestry. But our organization is really two sides of the coin. One is our food and farm program. And the farm program grows and distributes fresh organic produce and poultry through the healthcare share program. And the HCS is a farm to hospital public health program that connects Vermont families with fresh, healthy food and nutrition education at their doctor's office. So the HCS providers at partnering medical centers identify families or individuals experiencing food insecurity, diet-related illness, or other distinct health risks, and prescribes a more nutritious diet with this healthcare share. So that can be 15 weeks of fresh fruits and vegetables delivered by VYCC to different pickup locations around the state. If you have any more questions about the farm program, I'd love to follow up, and I encourage you to check out our website. The other side of our programming is the conservation program, and that's something that is more traditionally what people think about as a conservation corps. We're modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps, part of the New Deal, FDR's New Deal to bring the country out of the Great Depression. Our work is mainly in small groups, working outdoors, oftentimes camping, building trails, maintaining parks, managing forests, and our water quality initiatives are a component of that work. So most of our crews throughout their season will do some water quality specific projects across the state. That could include, sorry, a little picture of our healthcare share there. Those conservation projects can include all kinds of different things. This is a group out there building a stone staircase, and we can see we encourage silly faces in most of our photos. But as far as the water quality work, we do a lot of erosion control. This is an open top culvert being installed at Lake Elmore. We also do a lot of riparian buffer projects. This is installing willow fascines in a river bank. We do quite a bit of lakeshore stabilization. This is a project in Waterbury Reservoir meant to stabilize a vulnerable slope from eroding and access to a remote campsite. And all the way down to the bottom of the watershed, we have crews that are out on the water each summer pulling water chestnut. It's an invasive species that is a big concern in Lake Champlain. So we have crews out there on boats for quite a few weeks throughout the season. So a pretty diverse sort of portfolio of work we do. And green stormwater infrastructure is a growing component of that portfolio and something that we're really excited to continue to do. It really gives us a lot of exposure and connection to more urban communities. So to explore GSI here, I want to take a look at sort of definitions to start with, and then I want to go kind of backwards through these letters of this acronym and kind of talk about conceptually some of the components that we think of when we think about stormwater management and GSI specifically. So EPA definition, there's a few components of this definition I want to pay attention to. The first being the use of plant or soil systems, I would say plant and soil systems in the process. We'll circle back to that. And really the main goal of any GSI installation is to reduce flows during storm events that reaches surface water. So it's really about reducing flows. And we do that through three basic mechanisms: storage, infiltration, and evapotranspiration. And there's a lot of different GSI or green infrastructure practices out there. They vary quite a bit. You know, a rain garden, which we'll talk about later, is sort of a subset of a bioretention type category. But so there's lots of different things out there. But really what it all boils down to is this sort of commonly used mantra of stormwater management, which is slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in, or up, and up, I should say. So to start with, I want to look at the term infrastructure, and Nate's intro had a great definition there. And at its most basis, it's a basic system and services needed to operate a particular sector of our society effectively. And that includes all the things that are required to maintain a balanced, healthy, and productive system. So I like to use agriculture as sort of an example of that. So when we think of agriculture and the infrastructure surrounding it, especially in Vermont here, we may think of a dairy operation. We think of the cows themselves, the barns, the tractors, all the built environment around them. But we also want to be really cognizant of the components that we aren't necessarily built, but are really our systems rely on. So for instance, being a plant and soil science person, I always go back to soil as being the really key component. It's not something that we necessarily put there. We try to manage and steward it, but our crops really rely on good, healthy soils. The same way that our crops rely on pollinator species. And in the same way, those pollinators rely on a lot of natural habitat surrounding our agricultural systems that we don't necessarily plant and put there, but all those systems and our overall agricultural infrastructure relies on. So kind of expanding the term infrastructure slightly. And moving to the term stormwater, so defining it as broadly water that travels across land during storm events, rain events, or snow melts, and eventually reaching surface water, so our rivers and streams. And every landscape produces stormwater runoff to varying degrees. So even a natural landscape will, in certain storm events, produce some runoff. But it's really, we're looking at that addition of impermeable surface when we develop a particular landscape, when we add roads and even agricultural fields and that supporting infrastructure, that we see an increase in impermeable surface. And with that development, we can kind of think of the effects of development on water quality as two sort of components. One is the increase in those pollutants that are in those developed areas. So we think of nitrogen and phosphorus coming off of farm fields or our lawns, hydrocarbons, oil, gas, things that kind of leak out of our cars onto parking lots, salt that we spread on our roads and our parking lots. So with development, there is just an increase in that amount of pollution that's available to our surface water. And the other component of it is basically the amount of water and how it moves through the watershed and through our developed landscape that really has a big impact on how we manage that stormwater. So this is a diagram that as you all, when you continue on to your careers in conservation or land management, will see again, I'm sure. There's sort of a lot of them out there, but it's a great way of distilling kind of what we're looking at when we think of a natural landscape versus a developed one. So on the left here, we see sort of an example of a natural ground cover. And you see a diversity of different vegetation there. So we see some trees and plants and shrubs. And so when a rain event occurs on this particular type of landscape, we can expect in general certain things to happen. So these arrows are depicting where water is going once it hits the surface. So in this natural ground cover, immediately we see 50% of that water infiltrating into the ground. So that's between half going into shallow infiltration that might be accessed by those plants and the vegetation, and then 25% going down into basically recharging our groundwater. So in addition to that, you see that arrow going up, and that's describing 40% of that water will return into the atmosphere after it falls. And this diagram uses the term evaporation. We used the term evapotranspiration previously, and that's really just combining two words and mushing them together. But there's sort of two mechanisms. One, evaporation will happen when water sits on any surface and is exposed to sunlight and to heat, and it will evaporate. Transpiration is what the plants are doing in this equation. They're drawing water into their root system and respirating that back out into the atmosphere. So, I would replace that term evapotranspiration there to describe both those processes. So let's look now at the sort of other end of the spectrum. So the other half of this diagram is describing an environment that is 70 to 100% impervious surface. So this is a really extreme example of a really dense city. In Vermont here, we have, a spectrum, many spectrums in between these two examples. But to go to this extreme, we immediately see in this infiltration process, we're now down to just 15% of that water that falls on the surface infiltrating into the ground. The evapotranspiration process isn't a huge drop. And I would argue that the main component of that loss of returning the environment is that transpiration part of that, because we're losing that vegetation to sort of facilitate that. Whereas water will evaporate off of a parking lot, just the same way water will eventually evaporate out of your a glass of water sitting on your porch. So what that leaves us with is now 55%, more than half of the water that falls on that surface is now running across the surface and eventually into our surface water systems, our rivers and streams. So the effect of that is both a increase in peak flows. So from a vegetated watershed to a developed one, you'll see a much higher peak in the flow of water that hits those rivers and streams. And you'll also see it sooner after a rain event happens. So what that means for our surface water systems are destabilized river channels, more incision and eroding on river banks, and then the ultimate effects on our lakes and ponds and decreasing water quality there, and which the series has been great, has a lot of people highlighting a lot of amazing things and research going on within the lake. So if you want to learn more there, I encourage you to check out lots of these previous recorded Zoom with the Scientist. So now that I've probably thoroughly confused you, I have a quick poll question for you. So the question is, when you think of a stormwater infrastructure, let's think of your town that you live in, and you think of the infrastructure surrounding stormwater and how we manage it. Which of these things should be considered a part of a town's stormwater infrastructure? A storm drain, B, a natural riverside forest, C, the Home Depot parking lot, or D, all of the above?
All right, the results are pouring in, so we'll give it maybe 10-ish more seconds as people. So again, which of these things should be considered part of a town's storm water infrastructure? All right, let's share the results. Justin, you want to walk us through it?
Sure. I figured you were all going to be on to me at this point. So the answer the correct answer, the answer I was looking for, I should say, is D, all of the above. And I threw a couple of those in there to try to maybe make you think about it a little bit or trip some people up. So if you were tripped up by my tricky question, then it's not your fault. So the answer I was looking for is D. And the two that I threw in there, of course, to try to make you think about it a little bit. One is that Home Depot parking lot. And when we, let me close that out. So when we think of a parking lot, we don't necessarily think of that as associated with managing stormwater. But really what impervious surface does really well is it gets rid of water quickly. This huge expansive parking lot wouldn't really exist in its as effectively without impervious surface. There are great options that are becoming more feasible, like impervious pavers and pavement and things like that. But I would encourage you to sort of think of the developed landscape as a component of how we manage stormwater, because really our roofs, our parking lots are there for that management of stormwater and rain events. And on the other side of things, that option of the natural riverside forest, again, that we talked about considering those natural systems in what we think of as our infrastructure to manage these things. And the takeaway from this is that the natural systems do it best. So whether that's right down from the riparian forest buffers, whether we're talking about a diverse and healthy upland forest as a buffer to runoff, as well as healthy wetland systems. So all of these natural systems are our best defense in managing stormwater. But the tricky part is the amount of space that's required. And when we lose these systems through continued development and altering the landscape, the stresses on these systems to manage the stormwater our development is producing becomes greater. So now the final letter in our acronym there, green, how do we use these natural systems or create analogs to them and incorporate them as best we can into a system like this? So this is a picture of Montpelier, and you can see pretty clearly a lot of those parking lots, those rooftops, all that impervious surface backed right up to the Winooski River. So when we think of how we can incorporate GSI and these installations and designed landscape into a landscape like this, it really becomes apparent that space is of the essence, and the solution oftentimes is to create lots of little small structures and small analogs to a bigger natural process. And that's really what we try to do with these designs. And so with that, we can shift gears and start talking a little bit more specifically about this case study project that Sarah and I worked on in just off the frame of that previous picture. And this was at the VYCC building in Montpelier. And from there, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Justin. Hi, everybody. This was such a fun project to work on. Justin and I, well, first of all, it's a really important project because it's so visible. And I think both of us really feel like getting the word out there and educating people on why green infrastructure is stormwater management and green infrastructure is important, and then how people can mimic some of that on their own properties. So I want to start first as a landscape designer, just why I got into that field. As a kid, as far back as I can remember, nature has always been a place that I've gone to kind of escape and to chill out and to clear my mind. And so as I went through school, I realized I still had that urge just to be around plants and to be in nature. And then I realized a lot of times the way that people set up their properties or the way businesses set up their properties isn't conducive for people to take advantage of nature. And so I went into landscape design for the whole purpose of getting people outside more and enjoying nature more And whenever they're doing that, they become a little bit more conscious, or in my experience, more conscious of how to respect it better and to create healthier environments. So that's one of the biggest things. As humans, we have to develop, but with development, I think it's also part of our responsibility to do it in a smart way so that we're not just dumping on nature, even though we have to have sidewalks, we have to have parking lots, we have to have buildings, but can we do it in a way that also incorporates nature and respects it, and so that, you know, we don't have the pollution or the contaminants going off site and causing these problems that we don't ever see. So anyway, putting in this rain garden was really important to both Justin and myself. And as you can see, so the first thing I do as a landscape designer on any property is examine the existing conditions. So this site was great. It's relatively flat, which is lovely, has great access. An interesting part is it has impervious surfaces on all sides. There's a sidewalk you can see on the right-hand side. It has a bike path down at the bottom. And then of course the driveway areas. Why that's important is because in the wintertime, it needs a lot of salt. And unfortunately, there really aren't any plants that love salt. There are plants that are tolerant of salt, but no plant is going to thrive with more and more and more salt. So, and if I'm jumping around, sorry, my brain works that way. With plants and with landscape design, plants are the final thing that you do in a design. You want to take in all the existing conditions. You want to take in, because it's a very human nature relationship, you want to take in people's opinions and their feedback, and those things drive the design. And then plants get chosen last, actually, which isn't so much fun for people because they always want to choose them at the very beginning. But there are a million plants that can serve the purposes after you go through existing conditions and what people are really wanting out of their landscape. So knowing the salt, knowing that there's impervious surface, that also is a cue of that it's going to be a hot site. All that blacktop will absorb heat, and so it's just going to be a little bit warmer than if you have something that is closer to the shade or doesn't have the impervious surface. It's a full sun area, and one of the pests that comes through is deer. So we have a high concentration of deer in Montpelier. And so that was a consideration with choosing plants. You don't want to choose the plants that they love to eat. So things like hostas and daylilies, deer love them and they won't survive. And then of course, soil samples. That was the biggest component of this. In order to put in a rain garden or a bioretention practice, you need to have well-drained soils. So Justin and I did a soil test and it was great. It was basically construction fill, which is like sand. And we went down 12, 16 inches, well-drained, super well-drained. Not until the day that we started construction did we realize going 2 feet down, the 24 to 30 inches down that we went, we hit a layer of clay, which is not ideal. So that's actually the opposite of what you want. But, and I hadn't experienced that before. So I talked to a few people that knew more about it than I did. And they said, you know, you might be okay with some horizontal infiltration, because the big thing is you want everything to be level and to infiltrate deeply. And so they said the horizontal infiltration might be okay. And then you'll see in a couple more slides, that wasn't the case. And so how we solved that problem was putting in an under drain. And I can talk about that more later. Ready for the next slide, Justin. So our project goals, and Justin went over this already, it was to slow stormwater and increase infiltration. Something I would love to nerd out with anyone else that wants to nerd out with me is phytoremediation. Filtering and degrading toxins. This is fascinating to me. Plants have the ability to break down certain pollutants and contaminants, and it's called phytoremediation. They can do this in their root systems, in their rhizosphere. They can do it in their vascular systems. Some plants can bioaccumulate, which means they hold on to those toxins, they suck them up from the soils, and they hold on to them. And so cattails is a great example of that. You need to harvest the cattails at the end of the year and take them to wherever you're taking them off site. And that's where the contaminants are. They're in the plant structure. And then some plants will actually change a solid toxin, like a hydrocarbon, into carbon dioxide or something else that they can break it down so that it's less, it's more benign. And some will change it from a solid into a gas. So they transpire it, which it's still a pollutant sometimes, but the concentration has been lessened. So if you want to, I will go on forever about that. I love phytoremediation. It's really fascinating to me, but only certain plants do it with certain toxins. And there's not a lot of research out there about that, but there's enough so that we used some of that research with the plant choices with the rain garden. Other things were kind of a given of providing wildlife habitat and interest for humans. Anytime you go from lawn into planting natives, you're immediately attracting wildlife. So that was really easy to do. And then interest for humans. Most people like blooms. So we picked some plants that had some great blooms and some good texture. And then providing a tool for education and outreach, which we're hoping this is doing that. I'm ready for that next slide, Justin, thanks. So the designs, we went through a couple different designs, and this was the one that was ultimately chosen. We called it the Bowl of Blooms. And the goals for this design that were satisfied were spring to fall blooms. So we didn't do any shrubs or trees, you'll notice in this design. They really wanted to focus on things that had a lot of bang for your buck. So there is, and when I design, I do a bloom schedule. So I write out all the months in our growing season, and it's what colors are blooming at what times, what's the foliage looking like, because a garden should be beautiful all year round. And even in the winter time, the grasses that we used, some of Echinacea and some of the other plants have seed pods or hollow stems that they not only benefit overwintering insects, but they're also beautiful. They can hold the snow, and it's just a little bit of interest. So I encourage everyone, don't clean up your gardens in the fall, leave them until the spring. Let some of those wonderful insects overwinter and enjoy kind of what they can do in the winter time. So some of the plant species that were chosen for phytoremediation, which I love, Indian grass, goldenrod, and little blue stem. Those three in particular are able to process hydrocarbons. What the resource, if you want to know more, one of the books, I'll just hold it up here. If you can see that, Phyto. It's a great book. It's kind of my Bible for phytoremediation. But they have done a lot of the research that we used in choosing some of these plants. False indigo, also called Baptisia, is a plant that nitrogen fixes. So it will take nitrogen from the air and actually put it into the soil, which is great for the other plants around it. With any kind of a rain garden or bioretention system, it's getting flushed with so much water all the time that you can flush out a lot of nutrients that plants actually need to grow well. And so by putting in things like false indigo, you can replenish some of those nutrients without doing fertilizers or even compost. You know, you really want this to remain as low maintenance as possible. And then of course, I'm not a nativist where I only plant natives, but I do encourage a lot of native plants. So these plants, I choose plants that are indigenous a lot of times to Vermont. And that's kind of my realm of native. If I can't find those, I try to do New England. If I can't find New England, I do US. And then if it's outside the US, I just make sure that they're well behaved. And definitely you never want to plant anything invasive or that could damage the environment. Things, you know, there are lists for every state, but don't plant invasives. Okay, ready for the next slide. So a poll question. We talked a little bit about plants. One of the things that is fascinating to me is that there's a lot of people just see what's above ground and they don't think of what's going on below ground. Plant roots can do so much to help to heal a landscape that's been developed. So, and this is just if you know it, which of these native prairie plants can have a root system more than 15 feet deep in the ground? Prairie dropseed grass, which is one that we used in the rain garden. Ninebark is a shrub. Black-eyed Susans, a lot of people know those. We didn't use the last two in this rain garden, but or all of the above. So what do people think?
All right, some answers are rolling in. We got about 10 out of 21 people answering, so we'll wait maybe just another 10 more seconds and then I'll share the results.
I feel like we need a little Jeopardy music. Or something.
I know, there's you can join us on the rest of them, Sarah, as we do this, and you can be our Jeopardy noise. All right, let's end that poll. I'm going to share the results and you're going to walk us through the results if that works.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, good guesses, everybody. So one person is correct. It's the ninebark. It's the shrub. According to, and it was I believe it was Iowa State University that did the research. I could be wrong on that. But ninebark can actually go down 16 feet was what the research came. A lot of these, and just so you know, native plants in general have deeper root systems than non-natives in general. And it's amazing to me. So the prairie dropseed grass, that one can go down about 8 to 9 feet. And then black-eyed Susans can go anywhere from 4 to 5 to 6 feet deep. And that's if they are happy, it's the right type of soil, but it's pretty amazing. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, getting into, after the design is all set and we're ready to go, the construction. Justin's crew, the VYCC crew, they were rugged, they were amazing. It was a brutal job and it was hot the week that they did it. So this took us 1 week. The crew came in and we removed all the soil. So, and I can't remember how many, this isn't a disservice to them to come up with the actual number, but it was something like 30 yards of soil that these guys took out. And the reason why we did that was because when you're doing a rain garden, you want to have really well-drained soil. You also, so the soil recipe, I'll start there, that we used was 60% sand, 20% topsoil, 10% compost, and 10% wood chips. And this is all mixed together. The reason for the wood chips, a lot of people ask, is as wood chips degrade and decompose, they are great at helping to generate and support mycorrhizal fungi, microbial activity, lots of good stuff in the soils. So that was the reason for the wood chips. The sand needed to be really high because ultimately you just want really well-drained soils. The compost, while not ideal because you don't want to be adding phosphorus and other nutrients to the soil, you want it to be lean soils, that compost is needed to get the plants started. Once the plants have established their root systems, then you back off on things like compost. You don't need to add it after the first year. And then a little bit of topsoil just to get the right texture that we needed. So the other biggest thing with construction was getting a nice flat bottom. So we dig down, we remove all that soil, and then we brought in our soil recipe. But before bringing in the soil recipe, we had to get the bottom absolutely flat. And that's so that everything is draining evenly. You don't want to have it lopsided or you end up having a swimming pool on one side where it's dry on the other. And I'm all set for the next slide, Justin. And so after we brought in the soil, we brought in our plants, and that's the fun part. And it's the really fast part too. It goes pretty quickly. You don't want to compact a rain garden. That's the other thing. So we have stepping stones. And during the planting process, we also used plywood and boards. So it dispersed our weight, because if you compact it, again, it's just making it less well drained. And the whole thing is well drained, well drained, well drained. So the plants looked great. We put them in and a week later, or not even, it was a few days later after the installation, we got our first rain event. And it was doing its job. You'll see in that picture that the forebay is full of water and then it spilled over into the rain garden. But then we had a problem. That clay bottom was an issue and it wasn't draining as quickly as it should. A rain garden in general should drain within 48 hours. And it was about 4 days after that first rain event that it was really draining. So we had to go back and put in an under drain. And this was just a perforated pipe that went straight to the storm drain from the rain garden. So it was still, the rain garden is still functioning. It's still slowing down that water, but that way the plants are happier. Because if not, then you would have to put in wetland plants. And there are other problems with having a not so well drained rain garden. You can get mosquitoes and other things. So anyway, we put in the under drain and then we were good to go. So I'll take the next slide, Justin. And how much water were we getting? This amazed me. So a great company called Stone Environmental was the company that did the research on how much, how large the rain garden needed to be. They did all the specs for us and then just handed it over. And in our case, they said it needs to be 400 square feet. Well, how much water is that taking on? During a 1-inch rain event, we had a parking lot area that was 9,600 square feet. And it doesn't look like that much water, but when nothing is getting infiltrated, it was all coming towards our little rain garden. And our rain garden was 24 inches deep. And so with that 1-inch rain event, we were taking on almost 6,000 gallons of water at one time, which is a lot. And so the whole thing is slowing that water down. So if you see on the next slide, where is it going during that rain event? The very first line of defense is the forebay. And so you'll see number 1 is pointing to that forebay. The main purpose of the forebay is to slow that water down immediately and then drop the big contaminants. We're talking garbage, we're talking leaf debris, things that are just going to clog and muck up the rain garden. So then after that, there is actually where the number 2 arrow is, there's a rocky channel. So that as the forebay fills up, there's almost like this little spout where the water can go into the rain garden and fill it up evenly. So then it's going into the rain garden and it's soaking down into all of that great soil, helping to feed those plants. If for some reason it's a big rain event and it's filling up, it then hits number 3, which is the under drain. And so now it's already been filtered by the forebay, it's been filtered by the soil. Hopefully it's being taken up by the plants at that point, and whatever's left is going into the under drain. So it's at least had 2 filters at that point, a coarse one, a fine one. And then from the under drain, it goes into the storm drain. If it's a huge rain event and the under drain isn't able to keep up, it spills over the top where the number 4 arrow is and will go into the storm drain. Before any of this went in, all 6,000 gallons was going directly into the storm drain, which went directly into the Winooski River. And the problem with that is the concentration, and what Justin was saying, it was the concentration of contaminants, of salt, and it's also the speed that it was coming in. It really is disruptive to the river ecosystem. And I might have one more slide. No, I didn't. So I'll take questions if anyone has them at that point.
Awesome. So Sarah and Justin, is that the end overall or just for Sarah's portion?
That's the end overall. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Justin, did you have anything to add?
That is all we have.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we'll at least, let me share my video so we'll give you a virtual round of applause for sure. And so participants, this is your time that in that question and answer section to throw in some really good questions. That way we can pose it to these 2 experts and we can really pick their brains about anything that you have. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I'm going to say, Nate, if any questions come in while I'm doing this, if you can be the moderator on that one, that would be great.
You've got it, Caroline. I am happy to keep an eye on the question and answer box. While we wait for those questions to come in, Sarah and Justin, I have a question for both of you to kind of kick things off. I'm hoping, and this is a question we've been asking all of our presenters, I'm hoping you could maybe just briefly talk about your path to this work. Sarah, I know you touched on it a little bit, and Justin, I believe you may have mentioned sort of how you got into this work as well, but maybe you can think back to high school years or middle school years and kind of your trajectory, just very broadly into the work that you do now, and sort of, yeah, just what you enjoy about this work, if you'd be willing.
Sarah, do you want to elaborate on anything you shared
Oh,
previously?
sure. Yeah, I think before I went to school for landscape design, I was working in DC for a nonprofit, and it was really stressful. They were sending me all over the world, and I was working 80-hour weeks. And I just realized I was so unhappy that I quit that job to work at a native plant nursery for $10 an hour, and it made my life so much better. So that was the turning point. I just hit this point of I need nature. And then where I am now, actually, so having done this for over 10 years, I love working with people, and I think it's so valuable just to be able to get them outside, like I was saying. But I also see this bigger problem that's not being addressed well. And there's still a lot of research that needs to be done when it comes to stormwater management and green infrastructure. And so I think Justin and I can agree on this, that like, this is the next step. And if you can get enough people to recognize it as an important issue, the regulations will follow. And so right now we don't have as many regulations as I think you need to make people that are developing, it's suddenly like part of the development process of, oh, you're creating all this impervious surface. You also need to treat that stormwater because it does have an effect on the greater landscape. And so I think that's where I'm kind of got a little bee in my bonnet of, we're going to make this happen. And how do we do it? And how do we have fun with it too? It's just so great to be able to encourage people to take a look at their landscapes in a much more micro level, and they're workhorses. So I'll get off on my tangent. That wasn't even answering your question, but that's where I am now.
That's why I knew you'd be perfect for this to help out, because you're fun to listen to.
Go off on tangents.
Yeah. For me in my position now, I mean, I really started with an interest in environmental science and learning about natural processes in college. To make a plug for UVM program, one of my a guest lecture from a professor named John Todd, who talked about ecological design, was really a huge light bulb for me into thinking about incorporating natural systems in the designs of our our society. So that was really an interest that sparked the science for me. Really through my career, the education and youth development piece sort of became a really important component for me, and the teaching as well. So really where I am now is a perfect intersection between those, because I'm able to work with scientists and designers and think more of these systems and how we affect the landscape, as well as I get to bring young people through that process and facilitate their learning and their career development, and to help them grow and understand these processes. So that's really why VYCC is the perfect spot for me to kind of combine both of those passions.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you both. I think there's a lot of commonalities, obviously, in what you both have said, thinking about nature and natural systems and human life, and like blending those two things eloquently, and how to do it so that it's fun and engaging and makes sense to people, and just making it more intuitive and accessible, involving people and saying, this isn't some, fringe gardening guerrilla effort. This is just how we should be approaching, water quality and life in cities and rural areas. Sort of, yeah, I really appreciate your answers there. So thank you. We have a question from Kim about how many projects does VYCC do in a year? So I don't know, Justin, if you want to try to ballpark that, or Sarah, that might, I feel like that might be a tough question to answer. But
well, it's so I can say that within the water quality projects, we do about between 30 and 40 weeks of crew time out on projects. That often those are typically week-long projects or multiple weeks. So not necessarily 30 individual projects, but so my portfolio involves about 30 weeks of crew time. We have about 15 crews in a typical season out there working during that peak summer. And we're completing about 150 total weeks of work. And that's from the AT to the long trail to in the lake to our farm crews. So yeah, we employ about 250 individuals throughout our program season. So just to give you some numbers to ballpark it a little bit.
And Justin, you're saying just for the water quality department, because there's other departments within VYCC, correct?
Yeah, so that includes the rest of our portfolio of conservation work and then our farm program. So yeah, that's across the organization.
Gotcha. All right, Nate, I'm going to have you take away the questions. When I'm in present mode, I cannot see them.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thanks, Justin. I know that you all do so much work, and that was actually even more than I had budgeted in my head for some reason. So yeah, totally wild. I'm going to blend a couple of questions here from Kaya and Steph. So asking about, Kaya in particular is asking about their condo community, hoping to build a rain garden or two, and looking for resources that we can look out for ideas and costs. Steph also wondering about just generally for DIYers spending more time at home, looking for resources to help homeowners in implementing a rain garden, or I'll broaden it to just green stormwater infrastructure that can be done at home or in sort of a condo community, communal living situation. If you all have favorite resources that maybe we can share.
Justin, do you have the I was gonna say, I feel like you had a few recommendations of resources on one of your first slides. You had the manual that comes from the Sea Grant, Lake Champlain Sea Grant. Yeah, which is a great resource.
Yeah, and I think the DEC,
Yeah.
Water Management Department, they have a lot of great stuff on their website and a lot of resources there. So that's a great place to start. The Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, their website.
I agree. There's also, just from the plant side of things too, if you go to Gardener's Supply or Horsefords, those are in Vermont. Sorry, I keep forgetting people are from all up over the country. But if you're in Vermont, Gardener's Supply and Horsefords, they have designers on staff that can help with choosing native plants that if you give the conditions, you know, if it's full sun, part sun, you're going to tell them it's a rain garden, so they'll know the soils, and then they can help you choose plants, and especially with costs, they can help you estimate costs. But you do have to do some calculations before to figure out the size of your rain garden. And one of the biggest things that I tell my clients is to save costs, to plant smaller plants. That's one of the biggest cost savings, but know that you have to take care of them for much longer. Watering is key. It's totally counterintuitive, but you have to water a rain garden in order for the plants to establish. So do that, and then they'll take off, and then you're good to go.
Awesome. Nate, how about this? I'm going to launch a feedback poll right now. I still see that we have at least 2 or 3 more questions in the queue. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. There's a few.
So, Justin and Sarah, if you guys are okay with it, once we launch the feedback poll, if people are willing to stay on at the end, would you be willing to maybe answer those 1 or 2 questions that we missed along the way?
Sure.
Sure.
Awesome. All right, so let me launch that feedback poll. So everybody on your screen in just a second, you should be seeing some questions. We'd love your feedback. We're nearing the end of the Zoom a Scientist series with just a couple more weeks left, but still always a way to gain more information. And we also have an awesome take-home activity that Justin told us about that's going to show a resource. So I'll let the feedback poll stay up for a couple more minutes. And then we'll do the feedback, then we'll do the take-home activity, and we'll see if there's any last-minute questions that we can answer along the way. So I think I have the ability to at least go to the next slide while the feedback poll is still up. All right, so the take-home activity is a resource that actually Lake Champlain Sea Grant, in combination with some other people, created a virtual Burlington Green Stormwater Infrastructure Story Bike Map. Ooh, that's a mouthful, but Nate's gonna put the link directly into the chat box right now. Or if you just go to the Sea Grant website, such as right here, you can click on there. There's actually 3 different bike maps that you could click on. The Burlington one, though, however, has the virtual side of things. The other 2 are more just a PDF right now, with the hopes in the near future of turning those into virtual. But the really exciting point, and I don't know if Justin wants to touch on this at all, is that there's actually one for Montpelier that's being created as we speak, that hopefully in the next week or 2 is being sent to a print shop to really get that PDF made of the Montpelier area and the bike story map out there. So I'm going to end that poll, which is great. And then I'm going to let Nate just talk about what's next in the series.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And if you've asked a question that hasn't been answered yet, I'll pose them to our presenters right after I tell you about our next presentation on Tuesday, May 26th. We're going to be joined by Dr. Chris Stepanek from the University of Vermont and our very own colleague at Lake Champlain Sea Grant. She will be delivering a talk titled Salting Our Waters. De-icing salts, most often sodium chloride, used during winter road maintenance, can contribute to increasing chloride concentrations in local water bodies. This can impact fish and other aquatic life and pollute our drinking water. After an introduction to this problem, Dr. Chris Stepanek will share information on how people can monitor a local stream to watch for impacts over time, and what UVM students and volunteers in the Lake Champlain Basin have found as they monitored small streams this winter and in previous years. So please do consider joining us. I'm going to drop a link in the chat box right now. That's to our virtual learning page where you can register, and also a link to our YouTube channel where you can find today's presentation, past and future presentations archived there. So thanks again for joining us. And I'm going to roll through the last few questions in the question and answer box for Sarah and Justin. So either one of you, if you'd like to field this question from Mara, what types of effects did or does 6,000 gallons of rain coming quickly into the ecosystem, so pre-mitigation, having a storm drain that's inputting that much water directly into the river system and subsequently the lake?
I can take a stab at it. I think the sort of the two issues we think about with that is one, the pollutants and the sediment and the things that are being carried with that water when it's moving that quickly. So a lot of that's just coming off the parking lot in this particular area, and the debris and all those things are making their way directly into the Winooski River. They're being carried that distance. The other issue is sort of the cumulative effect of, this is one storm drain into one culvert into the Winooski. But when you have in a rain event, when you have 30 of them along just that stretch of the Winooski, then you're seeing those really big peak flows that happen really fast and are contributing to flooding downstream, or contributing to the amount of erosion and bank incision and things like that. So that's sort of the more accumulative effect of
And with wildlife, that when you're getting such a surge from an impervious surface, it stirs up the water and can cloud it. And so you think of the wildlife that can't really survive as well when the water's not as oxygenated, and whenever you've got these plumes of sediment and contaminants. And so you actually have What we have in Montpelier, which is a problem, it's a channelized river for the North Branch, which enters the Winooski. And so it speeds up the river. And, there are a lot of species that can't deal with the channelization as well. And then you add on to it, the stormwater that's coming into it. So we have dead zones where there really isn't much life, and there should be. You should be able to just turn over stones and see things that are growing and that are alive. And so we're trying to bring back some more of those species by lessening things like this, the stormwater that's entering.
Yeah, the example I can think of is I know that a local school, I live in the Richmond area, and at local school, they did their classic, like they raised their trout in the classroom. And I'm sure some of you remember that Halloween storm this year, which definitely did some damage in the Richmond area. And that school had just the day before released all of the trout, the little hatchlings that they had been weeks in the classroom, launched the day before, and that rip-roaring flood came right through. And that, thinking about the wildlife and the habitat, there's no way that these little fish with that much water and current would have been able to survive. So that wildlife impact of stormwater events, kind of, that one was right in my brain.
Yeah, and again, the balancing and the implementation of green stormwater infrastructure, sort of, for lack of a better term, two birds, one stone, in terms of protecting our human communities downstream, and at the same time the more than human communities and the ecosystem at large, which you all covered, which is great. We also have a question from Kim, and perhaps Aiden and Isaac as well. Are there other plants whose roots go as deep as the 9-bark? Perhaps this is a question for Sarah.
I'll take it. There are plants that now I need to do more research on this because I came across it in one of my readings. But there are a lot of riparian, meaning like up against rivers and ponds and lakes, riparian plants whose root systems kind of seek out water and can go very deep. So cottonwoods, willow, black locust, those are all plants that you'll commonly see on our rivers and streams. I read that cottonwoods, and I need to prove this, but can go upwards of 75 feet deep, which is bananas to me. But it's something really important to know when you're placing trees, in particular, trees and shrubs. You don't want them over top of sewer water lines, and especially willows. I have seen this happen. They will seek out the pipes that hold water or sewer, and they can actually find a way to get into them and break them. So it's kind of crazy. Don't ever plant a willow near your leach field, near your buried utilities. You don't want to deal with that. But yes, many plants go very, very deep. And the trees, I would think, are the deepest. That's a good question, though.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. It makes me think of like those images of an iceberg, right, where you see like the top of the iceberg and then like all of it down below. And the same thing with trees, right? You think of like the sapling that you see, and then you think about like the crazy network of roots underneath that you don't get to see. So, yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sarah. And I think we have one more opportunity for you to get excited. We have a question from Laura, which is a short question, but I imagine you might be able to go on for quite a while with it. How does goldenrod photoremediate?
Oh, great question. So it's lumped into the same category as the little blue stem and the Indian grass. We chose those 3 species because they degrade hydrocarbons in their vascular system. It's getting into some chemistry and some other subjects that I am not as able to explain. I kind of trust the scientists on this, but they're ones that are not bioaccumulators. And there isn't a lot of research on the length of time that it takes to degrade these hydrocarbons. We just know that it happens. So, you'll plant something else that's maybe not a goldenrod, and that area maybe has however much, hydrocarbons in that soil, and it takes 50 years for that to naturally biodegrade. And then you plant all goldenrods and it might be 25 years. So timing wise and like the amount that's in it. But something so interesting, I was on the Burlington bike path last year and I just took a picture of it because it was so incredible. It was all asphalt. The Burlington bike path in Vermont is paved. And there is a concrete retaining wall on one side and the railroad tracks on the other. So there should be no plant matter in this space of 15 feet. It's railroad, which they use a lot of times herbicides to keep that clear. And then the asphalt bike path, and then this concrete retaining wall onto sand, onto a beach. And there was goldenrod growing in the cracks of the asphalt on the bike path. And how beautiful. I mean, the plants that we typically call weeds are a lot of times those plants that are able to not only deal with that toxic environment, but they're able to start healing it. And so it's just one of those signs of Mother Nature of like, this isn't really healthy. Let's make it healthier and coming back. And so a lot of the weeds that you see are doing a job. And so maybe don't be so quick to pull them next time and look into what they're helping to pollinate. Goldenrod, we have 42 species of native goldenrod to Vermont. They're amazing pollinators. Lots of different bees and flies and other insects use them. So I will go on forever about that if you let me.
I was gonna let you run for as long as you wanted. I especially appreciate the sentiment about a weed, right? There's no such thing as a weed, just a misunderstood or underused plant.
That's right.
So yeah. Well, that's all the questions we have. I want to thank you both a ton for joining us today. It was a great presentation. So yeah, and thanks to all of you that stuck around and joined us today. Really appreciate it, and all your questions and engagement. And please do join us in the future next week and beyond for our last few Zoom a Scientist sessions as we speed into summer. So thanks everyone for joining us. And
Thank you.
Soon. Yeah, thanks.
It was great.
Thanks, Justin and Sarah and Maggie.